Welcome to this edition of Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Rachel Gibson, Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, and your host for today's program. Today we're talking with our friend from Civic Nebraska about voter ID and how to prepare for your next year's elections. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse political candidates or parties. The League does, however, take positions on issues. Our purpose is to empower voters and defend democracy. Go Vote Omaha primarily focuses on policy issues, and as a result of our discussions, we hope you will feel ready to make informed decisions at election time. During the last election cycle, the voters of Nebraska passed a measure to enforce voter ID. This past legislative session, our representatives had to produce legislation that outlined these rules and expectations of voter ID within the state. LB 514 emerged and passed with 38 yes votes, 1 no vote, and 9 present not voting. Today joining us is the Director of Voting Rights at Civic Nebraska, Heather Engdahl, to talk about what LB 514 means for Nebraskans. So thank you so much for being here, Heather. I always enjoy chatting with you. So to begin, can you just tell us a little bit about your organization and what role it plays?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rachel. So Civic Nebraska is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So of course we're nonpartisan in all the work that we do. Our mission is to build a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. And we really want to get Nebraskans of all ages and backgrounds engaged in our democracy in every way possible. And so we do have 3 program areas. Like you mentioned, I'm the Director of Voting Rights, so I get to oversee our great team who does a lot of advocacy for and against bills that affect our elections, and also a lot of get out the vote work. So you'll hear from us with the upcoming election. We want everybody to participate in the election, no matter who you want to vote for or who you are. We want to help everybody get their vote in and make sure that their ballot can count. And then also we have 2 other program areas. So we have Youth Civic Leadership, which hosts after-school programs at 3 schools in Omaha and in Lincoln. And then we also have our Civic Health team, who builds more connected and engaged communities across the state, but especially in Lincoln. You might have heard of Collective Impact Lincoln, which is a partnership of several organizations working to connect with our neighborhoods, our residents, and really talk to neighbors about what their concerns are and how we can build stronger, safer communities for them. With them, I should say. And so our 3 program areas build toward that one mission where, again, we just want to engage everybody in as many ways as possible so that folks can be taking part in our democracy. We know it's stronger when more folks are participating and represented in it.
And this is why we have you on, because the League and Civic have very similar missions, so I always love when we get to work together. Voter ID is something that both of our organizations have been paying attention to, looking at. Can you start just with a quick recap of what voter ID is broadly, and maybe what we've seen nationally of the impact of similar legislation at other states?
Absolutely, absolutely. So at its base, voter ID is a policy that requires all voters to present an ID before participating in the elections. So usually it's before receiving their ballot to cast in each given election. And so nationally, we've definitely seen policies like voter ID and voter ID itself on the rise. And it varies by state. Some are more strict than others. Our new policy does put us in that category of a more strict photo identification. So not all voter ID policies require a photo on the identification, which is interesting, but most do. Additionally, some policies would require an address or an expiration date on the ID. Similarly, it varies what types of IDs are accepted. And so every state varies, but the majority of states do now have some form of voter ID that is passed in their laws and is required of voters. And so from our standpoint, of course, that is another barrier to the ballot box. And so we advocated to ensure that the policy that Nebraska would see could be as accessible as possible and as accommodating as possible for many voters who, again, another barrier to the ballot box could deter them from voting and making their voice heard in our democracy.
So with that, what is kind of the argument for, or the reasoning for needing voter ID? What's presented? I mean, you've alluded to the fact that oftentimes that makes more hurdles, but what's the argument that we often hear that voter ID should exist?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several. I think the biggest argument for voter ID is to improve the security of our elections. So there are a lot of concerns from voters across the nation about the security of our elections, but also the accuracy and fairness of election results. I think we've seen a rise in that since the 2020 election and all that happened in that year. And so, wanting to make sure that there are more steps to verify one's identity before they participate in an election would hopefully in turn increase folks' confidence in our systems. And I'm really hopeful here in Nebraska that that can be the case, that after implementing voter ID, Nebraska voters all across the board can have a lot more confidence that there is this added security measure, and we're going to help folks navigate it if there's any issues, and we can trust our election results because they're safe, they're secure, and our election officials go through every step to certify those results.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of that, the legislation that was debated this spring to implement what the voters said, hey, we want voter ID. There were quite a variety, and some were more strict, and others were not as strict. So, what did your work look like this session? Was it working with legislators? Was it sharing data? What did that look like as they had this conversation?
Yeah, it was quite the whirlwind, I've got to say. We were definitely busy. So for my work specifically, I first dove into each of those introduced pieces of legislation. Unpacking the very restrictive ones and all of the other ones too, to kind of see exactly what types of restrictions and requirements would be in each bill. And then from there, working with, I want to shout out Heidi Ewing, our public policy director at Civic Nebraska, who many folks, if you were at the Capitol and part of this process, know Heidi met with senators day in and day out to really try to lobby for an accessible and accommodating voter ID policy. And we were pretty successful in doing that, and it looked like a lot of one-on-one meetings, small group meetings, and just talking through all of the different ways that voters might be impacted by voter ID, but also how they might be able to navigate the new requirements, and making sure that we're thinking of all types of voters, right? And so for my role, I have the honor of also working on the grassroots side. So I get to engage with voters and the community, and I love that part of my job. And so through our statewide Voting Rights and Democracy Coalition, we were able to activate our grassroots networks and to also make sure that voters themselves were able to speak and be heard and share their concerns or their support for the different pieces of legislation that would implement voter ID. So there were a lot of moving parts, I would say, definitely a lot of moving parts, but really just talking, human to human about this topic was really at the root of my work during session, and just really trying to seek understanding. So understanding of all of the bills introduced, but then also everybody had different perspectives too of what voter ID might mean for their voting experience. And so it was really important to me to hear everybody out and seek as deep of understanding as possible.
Yeah, I watched the hearing for one of the voter ID, well, they were packaged on the same day to be heard, but that was a really fascinating hearing, and I love the point that you made about bringing in the different voices, because there were things I hadn't thought of, like tribal communities, or how does military ID fit into that? So it was really interesting to see all those different pieces, and I'm very glad that our senators seemed open to hearing those different perspectives, for sure.
Yeah, and I want to give a quick shout out also to the Government Committee, Government, Military and Veterans Affairs Committee at our state legislature, because those committee members really had a big job on their plate. I mean, they were tasked with navigating this task of implementing a new voter ID requirement, or passing legislation, I should say, of a new voter ID requirement. And that really took up a lot of their time too, I must say. I mean, the Government Committee sees so many bills that are related to our elections and many other topics and issues too. And so for them to make sure that they were doing their research and talking amongst each other as well, and setting aside times when they would meet and draft their amendment to LB 514, those are huge undertakings that can't go missed.
Yeah. So what is the result of this? Maybe from a voter's standpoint, what is different from how voters previously voted to now that this legislation has been enacted?
Yeah, great question. Basically now, we will be required to show ID before voting. And previously, there was no voter ID requirement at the time of voting. And so we still register to vote. I'll start from the beginning. The first step is always registering to vote.
Which everyone should do.
Yes, if you're not registered, get registered. And also check, you might need to update it so you know when we move and have a name change. So make sure that your registration's up to date. Nothing changes with that process. But then when you go to vote, if you go to your polling place, formerly you were asked just for your name and your address, and then you'd sign the poll book. Now you will need to present your photo ID at that point. And similarly to vote by mail, we'll still have the absentee request forms, or application forms, and now there will be a field for your license number or your ID number on that form. And so the different iterations of the legislation had different ways that voter ID would be implemented for voting by mail. And I truly think that this process will be helpful as possible so that voters can provide that number. And if you don't have your ID number or you don't have the traditional state ID, you would then have a photocopy of another accepted ID in your envelope with your ballot request. And so this also works really well for the election officials in their offices so that they can process those requests and make sure folks have voter ID at that point, and that gives them that time for turnaround and getting ballots out to folks to hopefully prevent delaying any of the counting processes.
So you mentioned accepted IDs. So can you talk a little bit about, in our rules now, what is an accepted ID, and maybe highlight some that are not going to be accepted that people might expect would be?
Yes, that is such an important distinction to make. And so generally accepted IDs, it requires that your name and your photograph are on them. And then generally speaking, a government issued ID, a public government issued ID, would be accepted. And so the traditional IDs you think of as far as a driver's license or a state ID, a passport, and also we're accepting records from like a nursing home. And so this was one thing that was a huge topic of discussion during session because we wanted to make sure that folks in assisted living or nursing homes were also accommodated. And so their form of ID would still have their name and their photo. Those are the two important pieces. But then they'd be able to use that separate form of ID to vote. And then, of course, college IDs. And so this is a category where public universities and colleges, those college IDs will be accepted. So we're thinking of UNL and UNO. However, private institutions will not be accepted. And so that's a little bit different and a little bit wonky. I would love it if all college and university IDs would be accepted, but it is important for voters to know that if you go to a private institution or a private college, that student ID will not be accepted. And so it goes back to the technicalities of the political subdivisions and the way things work in the bill and language, but that is one important distinction to make. And then a couple of other accepted IDs would be military IDs, so those have your name and your photo on those, as well as tribal IDs, so Native American voters would be able to use those IDs as well as they have a name and photo on them. And then one thing to note on IDs that are not accepted, any out-of-state IDs will not be accepted. So that is an important note because you will need to have a Nebraska-issued ID or a federally issued ID in order to vote in our elections. And so that could be a barrier for folks. Additionally, your social security card or any other identifying document that does not have your photo and your name on it, those would not be accepted. And so that might be a little bit confusing just because those identifying documents would be otherwise accepted for most other purposes. But as the bill is written, as our legislation is written, it does need to have your name and your photo on it.
And I'm guessing you can't combine. So you can't use like an ID that then with your social security card and like it counts because you're like, look, my name's the same on both, right? No, that doesn't work that way? Okay.
No. I feel like I'm at the DMV though.
Right,
I feel like that's the process.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, no.
Yes, okay. And I think you brought up a great point about students, particularly students who are at higher education institutions. a lot of them may be registered back at home or here, so that's such a great reminder that everyone should check where they're registered.
Yes, and a timely reminder that you can vote in either location as long as you only vote once in one place.
Yes.
So for students who are here, if you prefer to register here, you could obtain ID or use your student ID if you're at a public institution, but the important thing is that you just vote once.
Good reminder, very good reminder for all of us. So you've touched on this, but I want to make sure I understand it correctly. We have a lot of mail-in ballots in the state, and that's just growing. In fact, we have some counties that only vote by mail, if I understand correctly. So for that, the requirement would just be putting that ID number on the mail-in ballot that you send back, like your driver's license ID number. And if you don't have that, then you would do like a photocopy that would go in the mail. Okay, so that is the process for that.
Right. I would just say I highly recommend that anybody with questions definitely reaches out to their county election officials.
Okay,
because right now our Secretary of State's office and county election officials are working really hard, really diligently to sort all the technical pieces out. And so there are some components that folks have questions about that I would highly recommend just reaching out in your county, and they'll know exactly how to guide you through that unique process for all mail counties.
It's great to know that that's a point person to ask if you've got questions. All right, so about, say someone's going to vote and they've got their ID, they think they're ready to go, and they show up and they say, oh, we don't accept that ID. Like, what does a voter do in that situation day of that runs into an issue?
Great question. So this is kind of similar to prior experiences where if you weren't registered in your current district or had any other issue, that you have the opportunity to vote via provisional ballot. And so with that scenario that you described, the voter would be able to fill out a reasonable impediment certification form. So there's a lot of words there, but
they can just call it a provisional ballot? Is that, or do they need to know the name?
That's a good question. That is a good question that I think the poll workers will be able to help navigate that situation, because you know, we expect that will happen, right? There's going to be a voter or a few that encounter an issue or another with their ID or don't have ID altogether. And so the poll workers are going to be well equipped also to help and guide voters through the processes. So you'll have a provisional ballot is what you'll vote on. But that reasonable impediment certification form is documenting that based on several reasons that you would select from that you were not able to meet the ID requirements. However, you are who you say you are and you are eligible to vote otherwise. And then by doing that, you're signing the oath, similar to your other important elections forms that have the oath that you are signing. All of the information you've provided is true. And then the election office is able to process your provisional ballot, making sure that you've only voted once and that you are eligible to vote, and they have it on file that there was a reason why you didn't have that ID at that time. But I do highly recommend, if you run into that problem, then trying to get ID, because it's important to know you will need to fill out that form for each election if that occurs again. So filling out that form one time does not provide you with, you know, a certificate or any type of pass on the requirement. But if that were to happen to you again, it would be the same process. So I highly recommend getting ID if you can. They are providing free IDs. I might just kind of share a bit about that.
Please do.
And so if you are a Nebraska resident, Nebraska voter, you are able to go to the DMV and obtain a free ID. For voting purposes, it is a state ID, so it's not a special ID for voting, but if it's for that purpose and you don't have another form of ID, don't go there if you already have a driver's license. You can only do one of them. But if you're in that scenario, the DMV is providing free IDs for this purpose. And similarly, if you're a Nebraska resident and you don't have your birth certificate, since you need that to get ID, that is also going to be provided free of cost.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's really good to know if you need any help navigating those processes, obtaining documents or getting ID. I know our team is here to help, as well as Secretary of State's office can help with kind of just navigating any concerns and issues on that end. But finally, I will say, similar to out-of-state IDs not being accepted to vote, if you were born out of state and are trying to obtain your birth certificate, Nebraska will not cover the costs of out-of-state birth certificates. So I'm hopeful that in the years to come, maybe we can improve that if there are a number of voters impacted in that way. But for right now, that is how the law stands.
So you've given some incredible details and clarity. If people are wanting to check in with their to make sure that they're doing what they need to be doing, it sounds like their county commissioner, election commissioner, or the Secretary of State would be a great place to find that information.
Absolutely, absolutely. I highly recommend those two parties as your first stop. And then also at Civic Nebraska, of course, we are ready to help. So I do have a voter assistance hotline, and so voters can call for any purpose. It's part of our election protection program that we do for every election. And so we are here to help, but I highly recommend contacting those election officials first, and then coming to us if you would like further assistance.
So moving away from just the ID, but just generally voting, if a voter shows up at a polling place and there's some sort of issue, what can they do? You mentioned the provisional ballot, so can they always ask, can I fill out a provisional ballot? Should they call someone? What if somebody runs into an issue at a polling place?
Yes, great question. I would say the first thing to do is talk to the poll workers. We have some amazing poll workers in Nebraska that keep these elections running. Who should be your first stop, right? And let the poll worker know what your issue is or what your question is and see if they can help you. If they're not able to help you, they usually do have posted in your polling place the phone number for your county election commissioner's office. So I know that the county election commissioners highly recommend that for voters that are in a polling place. Sometimes even the poll workers will recommend that the voter calls that phone number. And then finally, part of our election protection program having this hotline, we will have election observers at several, hopefully many polling places across the state. So if you happen to see an observer, we're nonpartisan election observers, you can let them know that you're seeking assistance, and they can either provide our hotline number or call us for you and seek assistance for you.
Oh, what a great resource to have.
Definitely.
Because that would be so stressful to think you're going to vote and then show up and be like, oh no, apparently I'm not going to vote. Someone help me.
Yes, and that's the last thing we want. We don't want anyone turned away
Right.
from the polls.
Right.
And we have some amazing election officials and poll workers that share that sentiment that whatever we can do to make it work and get that provisional ballot in, if that's what's necessary, we want everybody to get their ballot in.
Well, I really appreciate the summary of the voter ID. If I can pick your brain about just generally going forward, what are some things that Civic is keeping an eye on as far as continuing to make voting accessible? What are some things that you're working on?
Great question. I love to talk about this topic. So one big priority is voting rights restoration. And so we are hoping that the bill number is LB20, introduced by Senator Wayne, carried over from last session. It's on general file now. Fingers crossed. But this legislation would remove the 2-year waiting period that folks face after they're convicted of a felony and they complete their sentence, including probation or parole. They face this 2-year waiting period before regaining their right to vote. And so this was set years ago. It used to be a lifetime ban. So it's great that it's improved from that. However, this arbitrary 2-year waiting period, it really just causes more confusion. The states vary on their policies regarding felony disenfranchisement, and that adds to the confusion as well. And so we're hoping to remove that 2-year waiting period this session. I'm speaking it into existence. We will get that. And that would increase access to the ballot box for many Nebraskans, thousands of Nebraskans that are impacted by felony disenfranchisement. And you know, these are folks that are working and they're paying taxes, but that's taxation without representation, right? And so hopefully, if we can get that passed one way or another, one way or another, we will. I really look forward to reducing the wait time to regain the right to vote, but also one day I hope that we don't have felony disenfranchisement altogether. That's a big pie in the sky goal, I know. And then also voting by mail. So we talked a bit about how voter ID would impact the voting by mail process, but there are a lot of ways that we can modernize that process just at its base too. And so, you know, the first thing that comes to mind for me is ballot receipts. I think that receiving a quick notification that they've received my ballot, that it's been counted, that would be phenomenal.
Like you get when you order a package.
Yes.
And it says, it's coming. I got this.
Yes.
Don't worry, you hit the button right.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. That would be phenomenal. And Also prepaid postage on those return envelopes. I think that's a little bit overdue. It is going to be costly, so I recognize why there's challenges there, but that could be really impactful for folks that would vote by mail, and that could be more convenient for them if they had that. And then also being able to request your absentee ballot online. That would be an ultimate goal. Right now it is only on the paper forms, but we have our voter registration portal online, and so I think there's a really cool opportunity to take that registration online portal and make a similar but different portal to be able to request your absentee ballot and fill out the form but do it online. And that would again modernize this whole process. And so that's another thing I'm very excited about. I don't know if we'll see a lot of movement in 2024 on that, but I am very hopeful, and we're building a solid foundation for those pieces. And then of course, automatic voter registration, election day voter registration, those are those classic elections policies that would increase access and improve kind of just the ease of the voter experience going through the whole process. So those are a lot of things that I'm excited about. We've also been talking about voting access on tribal lands, voting access in jails, so folks that don't have a felony conviction do still have the right to vote. So we want to make sure we can do everything we can to increase access to voting for all voters, no matter their party affiliation or background or location.
Well, it sounds like this is a very complex issue, really important issue. We're so glad that Civic Nebraska is working on this, and as part of the coalition that works on some of the things at the legislature, we always appreciate your expertise and guidance on things. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and talk a little bit about voter ID. Just as a quick reminder to voters, this does start with the primary elections coming up, so now is a great time to check and make sure that your ID, you have an ID that works and it's up to date, as Heather pointed out. And if you run into issues or you have questions, your county commissioner, Secretary of State, and of course Civic Nebraska, a great place to go to get those details. So thank you again for speaking with us and joining on our program. For the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, I'm Rachel Gibson, reminding you to inform yourself about issues and candidates and be ready to go vote Omaha.